Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us here at Georgetown's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life for this live-streamed public dialogue on the consistent ethic of life in 2023, solidarity with those who are poor and vulnerable. We're so grateful to have so many of you joining us here today with some 2,000 people already pre-registered for the conversation. So last June, the Dobbs decision overturned Roe versus Wade, generating intense debate about abortion and creating new opportunities and challenges for the pro-life movement. Tomorrow's March for Life ends not at the Supreme Court as in past years, but at the US Capitol. This past year, we've also seen continuing and increasing threats to the lives and dignity of the most vulnerable among us across a range of issues, from the continuing humanitarian crisis at the US southern border to the continued use of the death penalty in more than half the United States, Canadian laws that are encouraging the poor and vulnerable to seek euthanasia, and a lack of solidarity with unborn children and their mothers in a post-Roe world. Too often, those without power or resources, those with disabilities, those facing injustice, go unheard and uncared for. As Pope Francis said earlier this month, we should strive to safeguard the weakest among us and learn how to be a community that truly walks together, capable of resisting the throwaway culture. Respect for human life and dignity, as well as solidarity with those vulnerable and poor, stands at the center of Catholic social teaching. And these principles call for a consistent ethic of life that protects and promotes the lives and dignity of each and every person, especially those in need, and regardless of age or stage in life, ability, immigration status, race, religion, gender, or any other factor. In the face of these challenges, we've brought together a remarkable group of leaders to explore what's needed to build a culture of life and love in the United States and elsewhere, and to ask whether a renewed emphasis on the consistent ethic of life and the ethic of solidarity that goes with it can help draw us together to resist the hostility and division that too often characterizes our public life. We'll ask what the consistent ethic of life means in 2023 across the range of issues we've discussed, and how those committed to defending the life and dignity of the most vulnerable can take steps to build an authentic culture of solidarity in 2023's social and political context. So let's talk about our wonderful lineup for this conversation. Liz Bruning is a staff writer at The Atlantic and a former opinion columnist for the New York Times and the Washington Post. She writes frequently on issues addressing life and human dignity, including a powerful recent 2022 series of articles on the death penalty. Bishop Daniel Flores is the chair of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Doctrine and the bishop of the Diocese of Brownsville, Texas, along the U.S.-Mexico border. He's also the Episcopal advisor to Catholic Mobilizing Network, which seeks to end the death penalty and is an advocate for unborn children and immigrants. Gloria Purvis is the host of the Gloria Purvis podcast at America Media and has served on the National Black Catholic Congress's Commission on Social Justice, the Maryland Catholic Conference's Respect for Life Advisory Board, and the Pastoral Council of the Archdiocese of Washington. And Father Sam Sawyer is the editor-in-chief of America Media, which in December 2022 published a strong editorial opposing Canada's euthanasia regime. He has written extensively about pro-life issues and clergy sexual abuse. I want to thank all of you who are joining us here on YouTube and Twitter as well. Please share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag ConsistentEthic2023 and by tagging the initiative at GUCST Public Life. And of course, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers later on, so please submit questions for the panelists by following the prompts at the bottom of the screen. This dialogue is being recorded and will be posted on our website and social channels for later viewing. And so with that, let's start our conversation. I'd like to ask each of you in turn to answer an opening question. And Bishop Flores, let's start with you. What does a consistent ethic of life mean today? And what are the greatest challenges we face in a society to promote the dignity of life, especially the lives of people who are poor and vulnerable?
Well, thank you, Kim. I'm very happy to be able to participate in this conversation. I just think, speaking broadly, that we're kind of finding ourselves in a situation where there are several fronts that of assaults upon basically the appreciation of the dignity of a human life, and that these different fronts show themselves differently. As we've mentioned, the death penalty, also how we treat immigrants, especially decisions that are made politically about their fate and their future, the unborn child, a whole host of certainly the elderly. I think in a consistent ethic of life I take sort of from Pope Francis a very important call for us in the church, especially to have to a kind of conversion, and that is to be aware of those who are most vulnerable around us, who are often sort of invisible to the wider society, who are most vulnerable, who are most subject to the exercise of power, be it by governments or by cartels or however it is, exercise of power that puts their life at risk and often makes decisions that affects whether they live or die. And that we have to be attentive to this and to be strong and faithful in sort of consistently defending wherever life is vulnerable, because where life is vulnerable means it's largely powerless to defend itself. And I think we need to be known as a people who speak for and who are aware for and serve the community that's most vulnerable all across the board. It's a broad front, and I think we have to kind of recognize that we have to be active in all of the areas where human dignity is being threatened and lives are being lost.
Thanks so much for that, Bishop Flores. Liz, let's go to you on this. What does a consistent ethic of life mean for you today, and how do we raise the voices of the poor and vulnerable here?
Yeah, so a consistent ethic of life to me, it mainly means being a sign of contradiction. I mean, I'm in the media, and so I think there are lots of areas in our culture where life is valued, but is thought of as something that can be forfeited, right? Life, your right to live, your entitlement, your desert to live, it can be forfeited. This is something that people think about, quite a number of people, right? They think that you can forfeit your life by doing certain crimes, or by just not succeeding in keeping up with everyone else, or by being disabled in certain ways. And I think the point of being a person who believes in a consistent ethic of life, this kind of seamless garment, is being someone who just stands in contradiction of all of that, and has a radically different way of looking at politics, society, culture, all of it. And Christianity is supposed to be radical in that way. It shouldn't make a whole lot of sense in any political context, because its kingdom is not of this world. And so being that sign of contradiction, being radical in that way, that's what I think about the consistent ethic of life.
Thanks for that. A radical sign of contradiction. I love that. Gloria, how about you? What does a consistent ethic of life mean to you today, especially for the lives of poor and vulnerable people?
To me, I think it means being actually present in a way that I think our culture is moving us away from being present in human relationships. Think about how much time we spend on our phones. Think about how much time people spend in games where they're creating their own world. So even their perceptions of reality are a bit off, skewed. And so I don't think we're plugged in, appropriately, and having authentic relationships with people, particularly the poor and the vulnerable. If we do have encounters with people who are on the margins of society, let's say, we often want them to be brief and not a regular thing. So I think even the way in which we perceive others, and particularly the poor and the vulnerable, is such that it's not reflective of reality. They are our equals. They are deserving of our care, love, and attention. But we have so many pressures and messages in society that want to have us push them away, have us not deal with them. That's somebody else's problem. So we haven't, I think, really been willing to give of our own time, attention, and gifts to people who are on the margins and suffering, and also considering that they are our equal and also have some agency in how they should be treated, that we won't even respect that. So I think we have a perception issue with how we deal with others, particularly those on the margins.
Being present in authentic relationships. I love that, Gloria. Thanks for bringing that to the conversation. Father Sam, how about you? How do you look at the consistent ethic of life today? How do you think that we should focus on the lives of the poor and vulnerable in this context?
Well, thanks for the invitation to this conversation. I think what I want to highlight is that I think the Catholic tradition calls us both to conceptual consistency about the ethic of life, but also to a practical and concrete consistency about the ethic of life. And I think oftentimes we can get sort of dragged to the conceptual side, to explanations of how the moral theology behind this is all coherent. And it is absolutely coherent, and that's important. But I think it's also necessary for us to recognize that those are the moments when we're focused on the argument that we are most vulnerable to being exploited for outrage or culture war or other things that basically serve the ends of those already in power. And that's, I think, where the call to that practical consistency, the call to solidarity, reminds us to reinvest, as Gloria said, in actual presence with and for those who are vulnerable and in need. I'd also point out, I think there's a strong status quo bias that leads us to assume that our present economic arrangements are sort of natural. And I think that often means that we don't recognize how much they're biased against consistently recognizing the dignity and the sacredness of life of people who are poor and vulnerable.
Thanks so much. And I think that's a great way to shift over to you, Bishop Flores, to have a little bit of a more extended conversation about this, about the idea of this practical consistency across a range of issues here. You're the chair of the Bishop's Doctrine Committee. You are the bishop moderator of the Catholic Mobilizing Network Against the Death Penalty. You're also the Bishop of Brownsville, Texas, a place where migrants, whether they're seeking asylum or migrating for other reasons, are often treated and viewed in dehumanizing ways. Why are the poor and the vulnerable more susceptible to being cast aside, to being part of what Pope Francis calls the throwaway culture? And how do you see this at the border today? Why is it so easy for some people to see the lives of migrants as expendable?
Thanks very much. I think one of the realities is that the de facto position of a lot of people who live a fairly comfortable life is that if you aren't successful, I think, as Gloria said, you're somehow have failed, and your failure is not our fault, and so why should we help you? There's a sort of callousness in that sort of calculation, and as far as Sam said, it kind of already is benefits, or it's kind of a blind spot in a successful, economically successful world that doesn't recognize that a lot of our decisions are basically self-protective of the status quo in terms of economics, in terms of just who we spend time helping or who we spend resources helping. And so when it comes to the immigrant family, for example, we have, and I think the media doesn't help us here in general, we don't really know the conditions of the countries they're coming from. We don't really know the faces of people who are, like at the current moment, the people who are across the river waiting in Mexico for some permission to even ask for asylum, which is the legal right, and so we're largely indifferent in a sort of callous way, because there's a tacit acceptance that, well, that's just too bad, but it's not our problem. And so there's this lack of relationality, this lack of recognition that to be human is to be in some sense responsible for being as protective of or as helpful to another human life that's right in front of you. And so I would certainly concur that I think that our principal responsibility here in the diocese, for example, is kind of helping to humanize the situation. The help that we give to mothers and children, the food, the clothing, to help them just have a smile, just to kind of, because a lot of, even if they do get a permission to cross the bridge and get asylum, to ask for asylum, there's a whole long process, but it's largely a very cold and purely legal process. And so faces are not recognized and people are not relating. And so it's just a legal, and we fall back into this, well, the law is the law, and if they don't fulfill the law, well, that's just not our problem. The church, the Christian, has to have a different response to the human suffering around us, and not kind of rely on the fact, well, the law kind of takes care of all of that. We have to look and see and respond in a humane way. I think that's the way we try to do it here in the Valley. There's a lot of volunteers. Most of the volunteers are poor themselves, relatively speaking, and which is very similar, just to conclude here, with who basically helps our pro-life movement, which helps mothers and helps give mentoring for mothers who've already had children. It's largely the poor and people who have a capacity to relate, to see a face and try to do something to help them. This is what's being lost in a culture that is just sort of like hiding behind it's just not our problem.
It's just to follow up on that. What are the factors that you think drive policies that keep the faces and the stories of migrants at the border or other poor and vulnerable people out of our attention, out of our perspective? Like, how can we, number one, I'd love to hear one of the stories maybe of folks you run across. And also, why do we not hear them more often? Why are we sometimes afraid to be that sign of contradiction that Liz was talking about earlier?
Well, I think for Christians, I think it's too easy. And this is why I think the call to conversion of heart that Pope Francis talks about when it comes to the presence of the poor, the presence of the powerless around us, it's very easy for us to just let's say, well, the government has laws for that, and so I'm not gonna, I don't have to really do more than that, and they know what they're doing. And instead of looking at the person in front of us, I think there's a whole series of sort of, we kind of sort of slid into a series of criteria about whose life is more important than the others. I mean, I talk about this a lot in the diocese, aquí importan algunos más que otros. Here, some people are more important than others, and we need to push back on that. It's a person, depending, it doesn't matter about their mental capacity or their economic capacity. Whereas we make judgments on who's economically useful, who's non-burdening, and whatever way we decide burden means, and who's going to be economically helpful to our interests. Those are the kind of decisions the government makes with regard to who has a right to plead for even asylum. And so the lack of the human sort of dimension. So I think there is an increasing, if I could even use the phrase, hardening of the heart with regard to just the basic human relation of somebody in front of us. And really, literally here, it's, so to give you an example, I was just talking just the other day, here in this, a little respite sort of moment I had at one of our places to receive some of those who had been passed to ask for asylum. It was a Venezuelan family, a young father and his wife and their children. And he just simply commented to me, he said, nobody really knows what goes on in our country, or what kind of conditions we are. Nobody knows, and because we're not talked about. And they watch news. They watch the cable networks. And they say it's all about other parts of the world, which is fine. But it's like decisions are made that certain kinds of problems are not going to reach the public awareness. And that's what he was telling me. And so I was asking him about his situation and kind of what they were facing. And I think we have a responsibility. This is where part of our responsibility as a church is to let those voices of the forgotten places even speak.
Well, and I think that the voices of the forgotten places, those stories, those faces, Liz, when I think about what you do, about how your writing really in such an evocative way brings the stories of vulnerable people front and center, that's what I think of as your unique gift in describing these issues and writing about them. You've recently written an expansive series of articles for The Atlantic about the death penalty, conditions endured by those facing execution, including those who are on death row because of injustices in the criminal justice system. And you've also argued that those who are unquestionably guilty of heinous crimes should not face execution because of the death penalty's inherent inability to set things right, to bring about justice. Why is this the case in your view? And how can this conversation around the death penalty inform a broader conversation on the way we understand the dignity of human life?
Thank you so much for the question. I think there are a lot of reasons that I'm especially interested in the death penalty. One of them is, I think the actual innocence problem, that there are occasionally innocent people executed, is maybe the easiest one to connect with people on, because nobody thinks innocent people should be executed. But there's a reason that I pick the cases that I do, and I rarely write on actual innocence. I almost always pick people who have confessed or were observed committing their crimes, people for whom actual innocence was never really a question, because, those are the tough cases. The reason that I'm so fixed on those cases is because, for one, I think the death penalty is sort of the thin end of the wedge. It's where people assert that you can forfeit your claim on life. And if we allow that there are things a person can do in their lifetime that robs them eternally of their claim on life, that just totally negates their claim to live, then that becomes an open possibility. And I think, you have to clamp down on that right where it springs up. It's a place where a lot of people feel a lot of strong emotion. I completely understand that. My sister-in-law was murdered in 2016. I certainly understand the impact that it has on a family. But the more important and overarching spiritual reason I'm interested in the death penalty is because I think we are literally forgiven as we forgive. And that when I have to stand before God and account for my sins, I want to be able to say, please don't destroy me. I never wanted anyone to be destroyed for their sins. I always wanted everyone to live and be given another opportunity. Please forgive me as I forgave I tried to do what you told me to do. And I think, that's important. I think facing the hardest possible cases, the most difficult people to understand, to come to relate to, trying to do the work of coming to understand and relate to them and find compassion for them. I think that's sort of the life spiritual work of a Christian. And it's sort of construction you have to do inside your own soul. But I think it's very beneficial. And I think that there are plenty of sort of straightforward problems with the death penalty that make it a worthwhile journalistic endeavor as well. But I would be misrepresenting things if I said there was nothing in it for me, because I take it very seriously as a vocation.
Well, and I think it's so important to talk about it in that spiritual sense, because we often talk about the many, many problems with how the death penalty is administered. But I like this idea. I like us focusing on this idea, again, of it being the thin end of the wedge for so many different ways of looking at human life. And I want to kind of take this, maybe one more question for you, because you have written about other issues regarding life and human dignity. And I love it, maybe just sort of following on what you said, if you could talk a little bit more about the vulnerabilities of the people you've met in reporting these many stories.
Sure. I mean, I pretty much consistently write on life issues. That's where I'm concerned. And my output does not work for the culture wars. I sort of try to make it inaccessible because the body of work is so mixed politically. I'm not really useful to either side, which is a tough position to occupy in the press, because you're not really useful to anyone. You're just sort of a problem for everyone. But I think that's what Christianity should be. It should be a big problem for everyone. Right? It came not to bring peace, but a sword, to turn father against son, and so on and so forth. And that's what that's all about. If it's working, it's causing big upheavals. And so I have met so many people who have, especially in the death penalty work, intellectual disabilities, people who, were rolled on by a more culpable perpetrator who pled out for LWOP, for life without parole. And gave up information, true or false, on a less culpable, more disabled co-offender, right? That's not an uncommon death row story at all. This is just part of the injustice of the death penalty, is it allows prosecutors to pit people against one another like that and give one life and the other death. It encourages false confessions. I have met people who are just physically very sick. So a family of one of the prisoners whose execution I witnessed, several members had diabetes, were otherwise quite ill. They were poor people. They came from a poor part of Alabama. They had worked all their lives. And it was just very clear that their loved one who was facing execution, who quite miraculously survived his execution and converted to Christianity as a result of that, had never really had much of a chance at, living a stable and normal life. He had been severely abused as a child. His whole family confirmed that. That's a common story with people who are in all kinds of difficult positions with the criminal justice system. And that's something that I notice even with women in the criminal justice system. They're frequently victimized before they become perpetrators of various drug offenses. This is something I've noticed in my sexual assault reporting. So again, getting to a place where you find compassion and you find understanding with people who are on the outs with society in some way, I think it's the most important thing.
So it's work, it's individual work that we all have to do. I think I want to highlight from that for sure. Gloria, I want to take this now to you. You are a longtime pro-life leader. You've served as an advisor to the U.S. bishops. You're a highly successful Catholic commentator and journalist, most recently at America Media with the Gloria Purvis podcast. We've talked about the death penalty. We've talked about migrants at the border. Now let's talk a little bit about abortion. It's several months after the Dobbs decision, just a day before the March for Life. Pro-life leaders have had the opportunity to take stock. And these months have seen efforts in the pro-life community and beyond to support women and children. Today's New York Times has an article covering some of those efforts in detail, including a statement that my colleague John Carr and I signed on to, calling for new policies and investments supporting women and children. And we've written on that other places as well. Where are things for you now? What do you think of these efforts to broaden the focus here? And do you think there's been a reassessment of what has happened, what needs to happen now? How should the Catholic community be approaching this moment?
Well, I think reassessment needs to be ongoing. And I think it was sort of hastened for the pro-life movement once Dobbs fell and we saw the backlash, we saw the misinformation, then we saw the extremes trying to become the middle. So trying to deal with the misinformation, trying to say, no, we never have and do not want women who get abortions to go to jail. No, this isn't about making sure we have more white babies. It's about making sure we, have a respect for the human person from the womb to the tomb, and in particular in the area of abortion, making sure people understand that abortion is not a solution for anything, and trying to say to women who are in crisis that, yes, you can do this. Yes, we will be with you. Yes, we have these resources for you. And now within the movement itself, doing a lot of coalition building. I mean, I saw the letter that you signed. I actually was about to sign it, but I had to get on here and join this panel. But the fact that people across the political spectrum are saying, all right, we need to come together and really push for the types of policy changes that will, we hope, make a culture shift, will hope make a shift within society that makes people say, okay, you know what? I have the things that I need. Pregnancy and mothering is not going to be this onerous burden. I hope Liz talks about her article about making birth free. I mean, these are the types of things, the conversations were happening. We're really looking at what are the structures that exist right now that we need to push for change in, and also to have an attitude change, if you will, that we need to talk about pregnancy differently. We need to welcome it even in the most difficult of circumstances. And we also need to look at our environment. I would invite every woman on this call, the next time you go to your doctor's office, look at what's on the wall. Is it constantly promoting the idea that you shouldn't be pregnant by making sure you get long-acting reproductive, contraception? Is there anything in there promoting healthy maternity or prenatal care? We need to really start thinking about the other messages that are sent to us about pregnancy in whatever environment we're in.
Thanks for that. And I'd love to sort of expand on something I know you've written about quite a bit, which is, can you talk a little more about how racism and racial injustice help shape the challenges to human life and dignity we've been discussing? And also maybe how this all individually affects you, how you individually think about the consistent ethic of life.
Oh my gosh. Let me try to keep this brief. We have to really push on who our champions are in the pro-life movement. I generally don't mention people, but I have to say we need to really consider when people at one hand say they're pro-life, and for example, Ben Shapiro will say he's pro-life, but then tweet incessantly about how Black women being single mothers is like the disaster for the Black community. I'm like, what? You can't say on the one hand, yes, I'm pro-life, but it's terrible for your community that you have these Black women that are actually having babies and aren't married. That's contradictory. And we need to call them on it. And we need to say, this is not, pro-life. This is not someone we want championing the pro-life movement because he's got it absolutely wrong. Same with Matt Walsh. All those kinds of things we really need to question and recognize. Just because a person says they're pro-life, we need to look at their actions and their words and see, does it really align? And I think a lot of times if it's not Bull Connor, like the obvious racist thing, people say, oh no, that's not racist. Oh no, that doesn't undermine the human dignity of a person on account of a race. And I'm like, it most certainly does. So we need to be much more sensitive to how we speak about who it is that's having children, and what our attitudes are toward those people who are having children.
I think it's another place to be the sign of contradiction that we've been talking about, right? To make sure that this issue is front and center. Father Sam, let's go to you now and talk a little bit about euthanasia. You wrote an editorial in America in December warning against elements of Canada's expanded euthanasia laws and the particular pressures they impose on the poor and mentally ill to end their lives. You said both abortion and euthanasia are rooted in the same lie that human dignity is so conditioned upon personal autonomy that profound dependence on others for basic needs can make a life less valuable. The only way to make death dignified under this this approach is to recognize the incalculable dignity of those who die by caring for their needs and accompanying them in their suffering. And I think that applies across the range of issues we've been talking about here. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, about the social roots of dignity in Catholic social teaching. Why is it that human dignity is found in solidarity, or as you put it, accompaniment through suffering?
Yeah, so when I think about the social roots of dignity in Catholic social teaching, actually what comes to mind is sort of like the contrary example, right? The question we hear after the first murder, according to the Bible, where it's, am I my brother's keeper, right? Expecting a no. And I think that reminds us that unless dignity is grounded in solidarity, right? Unless the dignity of someone else is allowed to make demands on us, then it's not yet fully grounded in the image of God, in recognizing the image of God in our brothers and sisters. And so, I think that am I my brother's keeper points us at it's a transgression against the negative limits of dignity, right? It's the you shall not kill commandment. And I think that's where a lot of our policy debates about life issues tend to sort of orbit. What counts as killing, what must be prohibited. But I think there's a deeper challenge implicit in am I my brother's keeper, that actually the Good Samaritan makes explicit, right? Who is my neighbor? And that's one of the reasons, when we look at Pope Francis's teaching in Fratelli Tutti, that's built around the Good Samaritan parable, because I think it reminds us, it's the question Jesus asked back at the end, who was a neighbor to this man who was vulnerable and wounded and in need? Who became a neighbor? Who chose solidarity? And so I think I would say, the full recognition of human dignity is in serving one another's needs, in sharing one another's suffering, and not just in respecting one another's rights. So that's why I would say the Catholic view of life issues has to be broad and consistent and seamless, that it can't just stop at the negative limits of dignity, but also has to help us, call us as a church and as individuals, and call our broader society to choose solidarity positively, and also to choose policies that reflect that kind of option for solidarity.
Well, and let's talk a little bit more concretely about this now, too. Of course, we're called to be our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper. And how does that look right now with the euthanasia laws in Canada? How do you see us not caring for our neighbor in these conditions? We've had growing acceptance of these approaches in the United States as well.
Yeah, so I think what I want to point out here is that there's actually there's a profound inequity in what looks like a policy in favor of autonomy, which is often the way euthanasia gets talked about, right? So in the editorial we wrote about this, we recounted the example of a man named Alan Nichols, who requested euthanasia and was subsequently killed at the age of 61. His only listed health condition was hearing loss. A month before he was euthanized, he had been hospitalized for suicide risk. His family protested during this process that he hadn't been taking his medication, he wasn't using his cochlear implant, and that he basically didn't have the capacity to understand the process that led to his death. And the reason I point this out is because I think that those of us who are generally privileged, powerful, like those of us whose lives are working well by the measures of our society, can often think about the question of euthanasia or medical assistance in dying from the perspective of, what would I, who am generally autonomous and independent and not actively suffering, what would I want in the situation where none of those things were true, right? And euthanasia starts to seem like a way to reclaim that autonomy. But there's a fundamental inequity in pretending that sort of imaginary scenario is also the situation that applies for people who are ordinarily in situations of vulnerability, dependence, suffering, right? That situation is the same for someone who is poor and for whom medical bills are maybe an outsized or an overwhelming concern, either for them or for their families. And to pretend that we can just sort of give people the autonomous choice, but the only real choice we're offering them is, well, you can erase yourself as a problem, right? That's not actually a choice. It might seem like a choice to people who have privilege and power and status, but we can't necessarily imagine ourselves into the situation of someone who really is in that condition of profound vulnerability. And so I think, there is a real motivation of compassion there. And I don't want to discount it as false, but I do want to flag that compassion is being sort of exploited and misdirected. It's being turned towards saying, how do we remove the problem rather than how do we actually express the compassion? And I think if we're able to ask the question, how do we express the compassion? That leads us to say, okay, what do we do to accompany a person who's suffering? What do we do to be present to the suffering, to alleviate it as much as we can? What do we do to support someone whose economic constraints might lead them to not be able to have the full autonomy that we want for them? And those questions, I think, are both much more complicated, but also much different than the sort of simple, just give them the option to die, and then the whole problem sort of goes away.
Thanks so much for bringing that front and center in our conversation. And I hope we continue to talk about that in our question and answer period. I'm going to go to questions and answers now because we're getting questions from the audience, because we're getting so many really important and great questions. And I hope we can just have a conversation about them among you all, and we will sort of move through them as much as we can. I want to start with something that I think has come front and center in particular in the last months, which is our responsibility to listen to the voices of women and to respect the dignity of women and make sure that question, that issue is part of these conversations, particularly in the Catholic Church. I think that too often we don't ensure that women's voices are front and center. Liz, I'd love to sort of maybe go to you first on this question. The effects of the throwaway culture on the lives and dignity of women. What impact have the voices and votes of women had in the wake of Dobbs? What can we learn from that?
In the wake of Dobbs, I mean, I have strange views on this that don't work for anyone. As you know, I always just suggested welfare programs. I worried about backlash. There was. The way that people voted after Dobbs, especially on a lot of referendums that came in the midterms, was just to go ahead and make abortion part of state constitutions and to protect it, even in traditionally red states, which I think was, kind of a natural and sort of predictable outcome after Roe v. Wade, because as Gloria pointed out, there was a lot of high emotion about that. I think, when I think about the main source of, danger to women's dignity and safety in society, it's economic vulnerability. It's the material vulnerability. When women don't have the means and resources to take care of themselves, to see to their own material needs, they wind up relying on people. And typically that's going to be a guy. And that's how a lot of really bad domestic violence situations play out. It's how a lot of abusive relationships play out. A woman's dependency on a man sort of yokes her to a situation she would rather not be in. And I see it time and time again with friends of mine. And it's why I'm frankly such a big advocate of welfare policies like Make Birth Free. Right? This should be something that every woman is capable of making an honest choice about and doesn't have to worry about the financial repercussions of, and doesn't have to worry about depending on another person to sort of fulfill her in, right? She shouldn't be relying on someone else and hoping they come through. I think it's something that we as a society should make sure she's able to accomplish. And for me, that's really, important in a person's self-actualization, is the real authentic choice there. And making birth free and childcare costs affordable are real important material steps in the direction of making that an authentic option.
Thanks for that, Liz. Sam, how about you? Can you talk a little bit about this, how the church can better listen to women, how we think about women's dignity in the context of these questions about the consistent ethic of life? Sure.
One thing I would point out here is that I think it's important for Christians, for Catholics, but for anyone who's been strongly active in the pro-life movement to realize that there are good reasons that we are distrusted in a number of scenarios, right? Which is not to say that I'm not authenticating all those reasons, but I'm saying they are real reasons and we need to pay attention to them, right? Like, we are distrusted in part because we have been untrustworthy in some of the political bargains we have made on the way to Dobbs overturning Roe, which I still like. That is a good outcome. It was necessary. I think, achieving legal protection for the unborn has to be a component, but as Liz points out, cannot be the entire answer to any fundamentally pro-life society, right? That we need to be able to support people, to support women in being able to choose to carry pregnancies to term. And it's so I guess the way I would say it is we've focused pretty intently on the supply side of the abortion problem, right? Like, can we restrict the availability of abortion? That is a necessary component of any reform, but the demand side of the problem is actually much bigger, right? What makes abortion seem necessary in the society that we've built? And what would a society where abortion doesn't seem necessary in order to guarantee women's autonomy? I think that's a society that looks very different than the one we built, particularly in terms of assumptions we make around employment and financial security, especially.
Thanks for that, Father Sam. Gloria, how about yourself?
Yeah, one of the things I think as we're delving more deeply into society and our perceptions, our understanding, I think we as women have to reevaluate how we determine success and being present in society. I think all too often our success is measured as if we were men, as if we didn't get pregnant, as if we didn't mother, as if we didn't breastfeed, as if we didn't menstruate, as if we didn't have a female body. And I think as long as we are patterning, is that the right way to say it? As long as we're making our decisions based on an understanding of freedom and equality based on maleness, I think we're going to fail. So I think we need to change all of that. If we're talking about really how can we more value and respect women, let us actually be women and measure it on that and have society make the attendant changes. We need to rethink how education is. We need to rethink business. We need to rethink the military, all of it. How is it shaped in a way that it makes it able for us to participate fully as ourselves, not as men, but as women fully in our bodies, the whole thing.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Gloria. I want to, maybe Bishop Flores, I'll start with you with this question. Someone asks us, what are the limits? You know, there are limits on what we can cover here, but interested in our thoughts on peace building, on how violence, right? A lot of the issues we're talking about deal with violence as a response to problems. And so this question asks how war and peace building fit in with these other issues, sort of for an average Catholic in the pews. How is war and peace something that can be made meaningful as a consistent ethic of life issue?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I think there are levels of it that are interrelated. And I think one of the broader sort of realities that we're facing in terms of the different fronts that are kind of assaults on human dignity and the viability of protecting human life and even in its vulnerable conditions is exactly that we often use death as the solution to the problem. And as Pope Francis says, you know, we keep killing people doesn't solve people. And one of the messaging, for example, of the death penalty in the wider culture is that death is a viable solution to solving this problem. And so let's use it because it is permitted. And it's justified. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why that's done, and then I think that translates into a larger question of war and peace, of violence as a way of kind of promoting sort of a greater good, and so that death becomes a one amongst many other solutions to however we think we can deal with this problem, whatever this problem might be, whether we consider it a threat or whether we consider it just a wider sort of like injustice in terms of the way the world is ordered. So I think the war and peace issues, especially, you know, the church's position on the nuclear armaments. I mean, it's to push back against this sense that this is just inevitable because we have them, and so we just keep using them, or we keep talking about using them. We don't use them, at least we hope we don't, but we keep talking about it as it would be a viable option if we had to, which means mass deaths of innocent civilians, which the church has always been against in any kind of limited war. And so you want to limit. But the way we tolerate, just like, well, nuclear weapons are just kind of like one of those things that, well, if we have to, we might need to. So this thinking about peace as something that is procured by killing more is part of the problem, no? But I want to say a little bit more about this messaging thing, because the messaging it infiltrates the culture. It's much harder to kind of get a grip on it. But one of my concerns is that as we talk about burdens or threats that people are, that we have this sense of of what does it mean to be poor. To be poor is to be somebody that has to depend on somebody else. And we have an allergic reaction as a culture to that because we think success is being independent and not needing to depend on anybody if you don't have to. And this is a problem in terms of how we look at social relations because we're all dependent. It's just some of us realize it and some of us don't.
Thanks so much for that. I think it's, again, really important to bring that aspect of it forward, right? And I want to go to another aspect of this question about who is unseen here. And Sam, maybe I'll come to you with this first. We have a lot of questions talking about, other kinds of violence in particular, right? So violence, we can think about human trafficking, we can think about mass shootings. We've just talked about War and Peace. One particular area of violence we've heard about is violence against LGBTQ people. Think about the Pulse shooting, for instance, and I think that some Catholic silence on that that really hurt people. How can we better stand up for human life and dignity in this area as well?
Yeah, so the Pulse shooting reference makes me think about. So my colleague and my brother Jesuit Jim Martin actually wrote his book "Building a Bridge" about trying to establish a better conversation between the church and the LGBTQ community in response to the Pulse shooting, and in part in response to the fact that there was a general what he saw as a surprising silence in speaking out about that. So I'd point here, actually, go back to something I said at the beginning, that I think this sometimes is a product of getting so tied up in conceptual consistency, like, have we colored entirely within the lines in moral theology, that it actually sort of works against or undermines practical solidarity with people who are suffering. And I think that also happens in a bunch of other situations. It certainly happens in the case of immigration, where sort of, the question of who are our political alliances about, and like, isn't there a right for a country to secure its border, et cetera? Those tend to erase the actual on the ground concrete stories of the people who are suffering in that situation. And I think the main thing I would say there is that the cure for this is not just better concepts, right? The cure for this is practical solidarity. I think about Liz's point about actually going and being with the people on death row whose stories are not the best stories available to protest against the death penalty, but nonetheless, that's where it's most, that's one of the reasons it's important to invest compassion there. That concrete solidarity changes our imagination about what's possible in a better way often than arguments do. I think this is also one of Pope Francis's points in constantly pointing us to the margins, to the question of smelling like the sheep, that our imagination will be changed by direct, concrete, pastoral presence with people in ways that no amount of theological, conceptual argumentation can achieve for us.
That's great. And also self-reflection about where we failed, right? And where we as a church have failed and how we can better live this practical solidarity. We have a couple questions about, Bishop Flores, and maybe I'll come to you with this first. Questions about the abuse crisis, questions about the Indian residential schools, and how we can better think about these issues, how we can be reflective and penitential as a church and think about these issues as part of a consistent ethic of life, about raising up human dignity and standing in solidarity with the vulnerable. Bishop Flores, you have anything you want to talk about there?
Yes, I think on both of those issues, both the sexual abuse crisis, but also the indigenous schools and so forth. I think if we look at kind of a broader sort of pattern that the church has to examine her conscience on, and by that I mean each of us, is how conscious are we of our power, and how conscious are we as to how we use it? Because it does become one of the dynamics of, and to make I think a humbler church is a church that knows that we should not be particularly ambitious to have more power or control over things. That the servant model is exactly that, accepts the beauty of what you receive, for example, in indigenous cultures, and which is in the best tradition of Catholic missionary life, always was receptive to the beauty of what was present already, although not perfect, but in a culture that was being newly encountered. And so, but this sense that the service is not meant to control, change, dominate, suppress, or abuse. And this is a self-examination that I think we all have to go through in our current sort of generation, especially as we become more and more aware historically to these things. But I also think that's something that we can invite other communities to question the whole issue of power and how it's used. And sometimes we are more conscious of it than others, and be much more self-critical about it in the light of the gospel. I mean, we do follow a crucified God, and we tend to not maybe realize what the implications of that are. And it's in the surrender of love that serves that we receive sort of the gift of the great grace that the Lord offers to the world, which is freeing. It's always freeing, and that's where we get that confused. And we have to always, every generation has to deal with that and confront it again. And that's how I would start that sort of discussion.
That's right, with humility and again, refacing this every generation. I want to just go back sort of to frame the conversation we're having today, right? We're focusing on abortion, the death penalty, euthanasia, immigration, and the failures in those various areas to live out a consistent ethic of life and an ethic of solidarity. Liz, maybe I'll start with you and then go to Gloria on this question. How do issues of race and ethnicity, gender, class, figure into these questions, right? So how do they help determine what issues get attention? You're both journalists and you both cover these. How do those issues, those ways that people are left powerless in our society, how does that affect how we talk about this? Liz, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, I mean, poverty itself is raced in America. And so, anybody who has a lack of material resources, find it difficult to influence sort of anything going on in society, because money tends to be that cash nexus, as Marx puts it, is how we tend to motivate one another to do things. And if you don't have a lot of that to stake, it becomes very difficult to get society's major institutions, including the media, interested in your plight, because you just don't have a lot to offer them in return for their trouble. Doing reporting on death row is not lucrative in that people hate those people. They don't want to read your stories about them. It's not a reader getter. The readers do not like the death penalty reporting. They like it when those guys are put to death. But it's still worthwhile to do it, precisely because the fact that readers aren't interested is just a demonstration of how powerless these people are. Right? That's the fact that society has thrown them away, given up on them, doesn't want to hear from them. That's powerlessness. That's being locked in a room 23 hours a day where no one even wants to hear your story. That's someone who has absolutely zero power in society. And people only wind up on death row because they couldn't afford good counsel. If you're rich and you commit a murder, don't worry, you're not going to death row. Your lawyers will get it right at trial. If you're poor and you get assigned a public defender who's maybe on their first case, doesn't know who to hire, has no experience in capital litigation, that's how you wind up on death row. And so, I mean, I think it's evident in all of these sort of, collections of life issues that they sort of threats concentrate around people who are just economically, materially more vulnerable, because the institutions of society are just sort of disinterested in their problems. And I mean, I think all of us who are sort of parts of these institutions have a duty to try to repair that. And so, but it means being sort of chronically interested in these stories nobody really wants to hear.
Gloria, how about you? What do you think when we talk about the impact of race, class, disability, other issues on these questions? How do we draw attention to that?
We're talking about it by really questioning, why is it that, we could hear about Gabby Petito in terms of being missing, and you never hear anything mainly on, mainstream media about Black people who are Black and missing. I did an episode on my podcast with the Black and Missing Foundation to talk about these stories, and also the kind of treatment these Black families receive when they go to police and want to report someone as missing. And the police like, no, they're not missing, they're runaway, which changes how they even investigate, or even if they investigate. We talk sometimes about intersectionality, which in some cases, in some parts of the United States, people sort of you talk about it derisively as the oppression Olympics, and use these really demeaning terms for something that's trying to for terms that we use to try to investigate or to try to analyze the kind of problems that we have. And so to recognize, for example, intersectionality coming out of trying to examine how Black women in the area of race and sex experience disparities in terms of the kind of legal remedies they can receive, being told by the court, you can't go on both bases. You can either sue on the axis of sex discrimination or race discrimination. So when we talk about things in these different areas, this is looking at these problems in an intersectional way, understanding that the criminal legal system treats people of race and economic backgrounds differently. We also have to look at even how we've been conditioned to perceive another person's suffering. Let me use Black Lives Matter's protests over the last few summers as an example, how people received the protests of Black Lives Matter as an affront to the American way of life. And yet we had people actually attack, the way in which we want to govern our nation. The people that were the January 6th insurrectionists, people received that as they're just patriots. And they're being, why? And I said, we have to really question how we're conditioned about who is angry, just has in a just sense, or who we think is just raging and out of control. Why is it that we are more concerned about buildings being burnt down, which are covered by insurance, versus, a Black man murdered in the street at the hands of the police, which we see on video? So those are the kinds of things, I think, even our perceptions of who is persecuted or oppressed or harmed and deserves our care, we need to examine that.
Thanks for that, Gloria. We have so many great questions coming in, and it's hard to pick as we end our discussion what to end with here. But I'd like to end with one that I think is important. We're all Catholics here on this call, and I want to talk about, again, go back to that idea of being a sign of contradiction and this idea of reassessing this consistent ethic of life now and our responsibilities to it and what it means to build a culture of solidarity. One thing it means is to pressure maybe, or to work with allies. We talked a lot about, the child tax credit and material and social supports for women and children and making birth free and maybe paid parental leave. We've talked about all sorts of policies, and Catholics have advocated for those. Many Catholics have advocated for those for years, but too often our political allies have not been with us on those issues. What does it look like for us to be that sign of contradiction, to work with, pressure, engage our allies on other issues, to say, here's where we need to come together now at this moment? Bishop Flores, do you have you're in such a complicated political context where, you've spoken out on migration, the death penalty, pro-life, abortion issues. Can you talk a little bit about how to engage on that?
Well, thank you. You're quite right in the description you just gave, that there's a wide variety of sort of like cooperative sort of witness that can be given, but oftentimes it's on some parts of it, but then not on another part of it. And so, there are many people with whom I can work in terms of helping give a witness on the death penalty locally, who would not necessarily be with us on the unborn child, and I realize that, and it works other ways around. But on the question of just like legislation, certainly here in Texas, we have to work with a very complex political system, and we can make good alliances with folks who wouldn't necessarily be with us on a lot of issues, but on the issue of getting more support for women and children, and for adequate food availability, especially among the poor communities. And I think we need to kind of just forge that and recognize that the integrity of our overall witness, is not necessarily injured by working with people who may not agree with us on everything. But on those issues, I think we need to work with those, and then also be willing to work with others who are kind of on a different focus in their activity. But the integrity of our overall witness is what I think we have to continue to kind of push forward. Every life is valuable, is worthy to be protected, and is worthy to have the resources to be able to kind of, access healthcare, food, water, the basic necessities of life.
Thanks for that. And unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap up. And I want to just go around the group here with just a quick answer. What's one thing you want viewers to take away from this conversation? Gloria, let's start with you.
All of these issues reinforce one another. So if you care about the child in the womb, don't be upset about the people working on the sin of racism. Don't be upset about the people working on police brutality. All of these things intersect, and we have to work on these issues because it reinforces our understanding of the dignity of the person at other stages in their life. So we're all really working for the same cause.
Sam, how about you? What's one thing you want people to take away from our conversation?
So I've talked a lot today about concrete, practical solidarity. And I think that can sometimes come across as some sort of, like some new thing or some like just post-Vatican II thing in the emphasis of the church. And I think what I hope people will remember is that option for concrete solidarity with vulnerability, with suffering, with dependence, that's actually the option God made in becoming human in Jesus, right? Like it's that option. And that's why Catholics are called to the same solidarity with everyone who's vulnerable and suffering.
Thank you for that. Bishop Flores, how about you? What's one takeaway you want people to leave this conversation with?
Well, very similarly, I think we need the integrity of our witness on all the different ways that life is assaulted is exactly a sort of pushing back at what I consider a general sort of callousness, which in some ways makes people feel guilty. I mean, I think we do this with the elderly. People feel guilty for needing help. As if they're at fault always, if they're the ones that are responsible, and they're made to feel guilty. I shouldn't be a burden, and this is corroding our society at the other end. And I would just simply say, I think it's connected. We wonder why there's such a high teenage suicide rate. Well, because children are hearing that if you're a burden or if you're a problem, it's better not to be alive, and it's affecting. I mean, it's horrifying how teenage suicide is epidemic in this country. And we wonder, how is that connected? Well, it is.
That's right. That's right. We have to be sure that we are witnesses. We are signs of contradiction about the gift that is everybody's life. Liz, I want to go to you now just to wrap us up. What do you think you want people to leave this conversation with?
Yeah, I think it's just important to remember that the people who are vulnerable and oppressed and struggling are not always the people you want them to be. Their stories are not always as uncomplicated and simple as you might like. And the people who are also invested in helping the poor and vulnerable are also not always the people you want them to be. But we take Jesus as our model. And one of my favorite stories involving Jesus, he says, "Who here condemns you? Nor do I condemn you." So one-on-one, when you're actually accompanying people, I think that that's exactly the attitude to keep in mind. Stay in judgment of your own soul, but subject no one else to that same judgment. Everyone else, only mercy and compassion.
And that's where I want to leave this conversation, mercy and compassion for everyone. I want to thank you all for being here today. Thanks especially to Liz, Bishop Flores, Gloria, and Sam. Thank all of you for your time here today and joining us. I also want to take a quick moment to remember Dolores Leckie, the leader of the U.S. Bishop's Office of Laity and Family Life for decades, who passed away this past weekend. We talk about lay leadership a lot here at the initiative. She was a model of lay leadership before it was on everybody's mind. And so I want to just take a moment to remember that. We really hope you can join us for other dialogues this spring, especially our 10th anniversary dialogue on the Francis Factor at 10 years. We'll hear from an all-star team that's been with us on various dialogues throughout the years, including Cardinal Wilton Gregory, E.J. Dion, and Sister Norma Pimentel on Pope Francis and the effect he's had on the Catholic Church in the 10 years of his pontificate. The dialogue will be on February 28th, starting at 5:30, and it will be live streamed as well as in person. We're also planning dialogues on Catholics and threats to democracy, on the Ignatian focus on global solidarity, and the failures of U.S. immigration policy. So please visit our website for more on this. And I want to thank my colleagues, John Carr, Anna Gordon, Christian Sunan for all their help in putting this together, and give a particular welcome and thank you to Kim Mazik, who's our new Associate Director and who joined us last week. Kim's a committed, talented, and experienced leader who served in key positions at Catholic Relief Services, Catholic Charities USA, the Sisters of Notre Dame, Dinamora East West Province, and she's been a regular part of our dialogues over the year. We're just thrilled to have her on our team. And finally, please join me in thanking Liz Brunig, Bishop Daniel Flores, Gloria Purvis, and Father Sam Sawyer for being part of this public dialogue on the consistent ethic of life in 2023, solidarity with those who are poor and vulnerable. Thanks, and we'll see you at our next dialogue.